couple of pictures I want to show you here this morning. This is a barn that was built sometime in the mid 1930s. This barn sits about 25 yards away from my parents' house. And this barn was built by my grandfather, Leroy. Uh, as you can kind of tell, maybe you can't tell, but the boards aren't real straight and milled nicely. He didn't go to Home Depot to buy these boards. These boards were made right on this property by a sawmill that he had. He cut down trees, made the boards. You can see the foundation there. It's all stone. It was made from stone taken out of that hillside right behind there. My grandfather was still a relatively young man when he built this barn. He was probably somewhere in his 20s. This is a man who, he never finished the 6th grade. When he was 13 years old, his father died. Emerson died, and my grandfather was the oldest child, and he became the man of the farm. And so sometime in his 20s, this man with no real good formal education built this barn that was originally used to store some pigs, and after that it was used to store his John Deere tractor that he farmed with. Pretty amazing that this thing still stands today. It's somewhere around 75 years old, and he built this thing to last. And it must be genetic. It must have been passed down from his father Emerson, because this is the oldest structure on my family's homestead in Pennsylvania. This was built by my great-grandfather Emerson, built probably sometime, and this is a real kind of tough to nail down, sometime in the 1920s. You can see it has a garage door on it now. That was added some years later, because this was not originally built as a garage. This was my great-grandfather's house. This structure is where my grandfather grew up, he and his 5 siblings. They lived in this structure during the Depression. And if you were to open this garage door and walk in, you would see that it still had the original floor in it. It would be a floor that would drive my wife crazy because she couldn't clean it, because it was a dirt floor. You could walk in, and if you walk in, and there's no rooms in it. There were never any rooms built into this. It was one large, open, barn basically that they lived in. In the back, you can still see an old port where the wood stove chimney would have went out. There's some kitchen shelves back there, if you want to call them that. But this was built, like I said, in the 1920s. You notice the wood here in the top. These boards up here, again, these boards were milled right on site from native timber. You can see it's black. You know what that is? What is it? Creosote. This is a coal tar creosote. Partially burnt coal would be distilled, and they'd make this gooey black stuff, and they would dip their boards in it, and it would be a preservative. It would kind of seal it up. This was before pressure-treated lumber. This is what they used, and this is, through that whole region in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, you'd see a lot of these type of things built there. This thing has been standing there for somewhere around 85 years, still standing. And still being used. Both these structures are still used. My dad uses that white barn. He uses that to store his firewood in, and he stores his riding tractors in this thing. Still being used today, after 75, 85 years of being in existence. Built by men who had no real formal training in building and no formal education. I can't build a birdhouse, and these guys are building these structures. Two buildings built by two different builders, but both builders had some of the same constraints, some of the same intentions, and some of the same beliefs about the results of their building. Both of these structures were built with only the materials that they could find on hand. Except for the tin roofs, all the other materials were basically right there for them. They used that timber, those stones to build the foundations. And they were built to last. They're both still standing. They both were built on solid foundations, solid rock foundations. And all the other building materials that were used that were set on those foundations were prepared, they were preserved as much as possible so that they would last. And longevity was critical to both of these builders because they had a common intent, they had a common belief that these structures that they were building were not just for them. See, back then, in that era, in that history of our country, you would build a structure on your land, and it was your intent, it was your belief that for generations to come, people would be either living in that structure or using that structure. They believed, both of these builders, my great-grandfather and my grandfather, both believed that people from their family would be working that land for many years to come, and they would be living on that land for years to come. So when they built something, they built it to last, because they thought my children will use this, my children's children, and so on, would be here using this thing. The mindset was that the land and the building would serve as an ancestral home for their bloodline. You go to Pennsylvania or West Virginia or anywhere in the mid-America today, as you drive through farmland, you see all these fields, and then you see these little clusters of buildings, right? It looks like a little town just plopped down in the middle of a field. Well, you know what that is? That's great-grandma and great-granddad's house, and granddad's house, and my parents' house, and there's my uncle's house. Generation after generation would build upon that land. And when great-grandma and great-granddad would pass away, when they'd be gone, guess what would happen? Some young couple in the family would move into that house, and the circle would keep going on and around and around and around. Not only would these old structures be used, but they kind of stood as symbols, right? It was a symbol of the family. This is where it all started. This was the humble beginnings of the family. It stood as a reminder to us about the sacrifices that the patriarchs and the matriarchs of the family had to make. What they endured. What they endured for future generations. They set it up for the future generations, right? It's interesting, some of these homes, not this particular home, but there are some homes where I grew up that there have been 4 generations of babies born in the same room of the same house. That was part of the culture. That was part of the fabric of our country back in the 20s and 30s and 40s. It's interesting that, the men of those days, of the 20s and 30s, they were great builders. They built for the here and now. They built a home for their family to live in. They built for the here and now, but they also built with an eye to the future, for future generations, for their descendants. It was all about for the here and now, but also for the future. And unfortunately, that's this culture of the homestead, I call it. We've lost that today. It's a dying thing in our country today, right? We don't see someone who's born in a town and they stay in the town all their lives. Like people are born, they go away to find a job, they go away to college, and they start their own family somewhere else. This concept of homestead is slowly disappearing. It's hard for me to accept sometimes that, Emerson's house is empty. Leroy's house, which I don't have a picture of here today, Leroy's house, my grandfather, it's empty. There's only one occupied structure on the homestead, and that's my parents' home. They're the only ones that live there. And someday, quite frankly, I got to accept the fact that someone in my family will not be living on that property anymore. My ties to that property, my history with that property, that linkage will be broken. Someone else will be living in that house. It's a temporary thing. As much as we like to think it'll go on forever, it's a temporary thing. Even though that linkage will be broken, and even though this concept of the homestead is dying in our country, there is still something within each of us that wants that concept of home. We have this drive or this desire to be someplace where we say, that is home. Someplace where we belong. Someplace where we have shared memories and common experiences. Someplace where we're loved. Someplace where we have shelter and protection. Someplace we can retreat to in times of crisis. Someplace where we can share the joy of life with those people who we love. Someplace where we can experience all the different phases of life. And someplace where we are bound together by a common purpose, the desire for home. Something inside of us yearns for that, and I believe God put that there. God put that desire for home inside of us. And God has always been that master builder who has always been there to provide for the here and now home, but He also built with an eye to the future. God has always been there to provide those who follow Him a home now, but also He was building with an eye to the future. I want to take you back to a story in the Old Testament. I want to take you all the way back to a story in Genesis of a man named Abraham. Abraham. Abraham was married, but he had no children. He had parents, he had relatives, but Abraham had no family. Man with no children. And God visits Abraham and He commits to him to give him a family. God says, I'm going to build for you now a family. I'm going to build now for you, but God also was looking to the future. This is what the Lord said to Abraham. He said, leave your country and your relatives and your father's family and go to a land I will show you. Go to a land I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. All the people of earth will be blessed through you. Abraham traveled through that land as far as the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. The Canaanites were living in the land at that time. The Lord appeared to Abraham and said, I will give you this land to your descendants. So Abraham built. Abraham built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. You know, there's this interesting dynamic that we see all throughout the Old Testament of there's this connection between land and building and descendants and home. It's all kind of tied up together. Here we have a childless man, and God comes to him and says, hey, I'm going to build you a family. I'm going to build you a family right now, but God was also looking to the future. What did He say? He goes, I'm going to make you a great nation. You're going to be famous. And oh, by the way, Abraham, I am going to give you this land. I'm not going to give it to you necessarily, but I'm going to give it to your descendants. And so Abraham, looking to the future, built. He built an altar. He stacked some rocks in a pile there. Abraham's building of an altar was to commemorate the fact that God had promised that his descendants would have a homestead. That they could be linked to some place to call home. But Abraham knew that this promise was for his descendants. It wasn't for him. The book of Acts says this, God gave him, that being Abraham, no inheritance in it, the land, not even enough to set his foot on. But even when Abraham had no child, he was promised to give it to him for a possession and to his descendants after him. The master builder God builds in the present for the here and now, but He also builds with an eye to the future. It was important to Abraham that his people have a permanent home, that his bloodline had some place to sit down and say, here is our ancestral home. Let's fast forward this story a little bit to the book of Exodus and a man named Moses. Abraham has been dead for years, many years. Generations have come and gone. And Abraham's descendants still aren't home. Abraham's descendants are in bondage. They're in slavery in Egypt. They're being used as slave labor by the pharaohs. And God comes to Moses, and He has selected Moses to lead His people out of bondage and lead them home. God reminds Moses, God goes to Moses and He says, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I appeared to your ancestry. I appeared to your forefathers. I have also established my covenant to them to give them the land of Canaan, the land of their pilgrimage in which they were strangers. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God who brings you out of under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will bring you to a land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you as your heritage. God ties the people to this land as their home, some place where they would go and build their lives there. God was building for the here and now, but he was also building with an eye to the future. Now, if you, we know, most of us know the story of the Israelites. Moses leads them out, and they're on their way to the promised land, but because of their disobedience, God punishes them. And how does he punish them? He makes them continue to be a nomadic tribe, wandering around in the wilderness. He takes away the prize of home. He takes away their inheritance. Until we fast forward the story again to a man named Joshua. Joshua is now leading the children of Israel. Moses was dead, and they're about to enter into their what will be their ancestral home. And God appears to him and he says, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise and go over this Jordan, you and all the people, to the land which I am giving to them, the children of Israel. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave or forsake you. Be strong and be of good courage. For to this people, my people, this family, you shall divide as an inheritance the land which I swore to give to them. Again, God refers to this land as inheritance. It's heritage. It's passed on. By the way, has he kept his promise to Abraham? To his descendants? Absolutely. Has he become a great nation? Yes, he has. You see this continuum of God's promises, always building in the here and now, but always looking to the future. Always gave Abraham a son, gave him a family, threw him into a nation. During that nation, hey, I promise you, I'm going to take you to your promised land. You see God's promises continuing to be fulfilled. Let's fast forward just one last time. Fast forward to the book of 2 Samuel and a man named David. Happens to be a king now. God has set up the promised land. The country has been formed. The country is divided into, if you will, states for each tribe of the Israelite nation. All the enemies have been driven out. Home has been established. And we find David now in his state, in his capital city, in his palace. And King David looks around in his palace and he says, look, I'm living in a palace made of cedar, and yet the ark of God is in a tent. David kind of declares, hey, I'm home. God has kept his promise. I have home now. And then he says, but you know what? The Ark of the Covenant, that big gold box that the Israelites used to carry around, that symbol of God's presence with the people, it was still living in a tent. It was still in the RV out in the driveway, right? See, when they were wandering in the wilderness, the Israelites all lived in tents, and so did God. God lived in a tent, wandering around the wilderness. And David says, I'm home, but I still have this desire to build. I want to build something for God. I want to build upon what God has given me for God. But that was not God's plan for David. David was told by the prophet Nathan, he said, this is what the Lord said, will you build a house for me to live in? From the time I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt until now, I've not lived in a house. I've been moving around all this time with a tent as my home. As I have moved with the Israelites, I have never said to the tribes, whom I commanded to take care of my people Israel, why haven't you built me a house of cedar? The master builder never asked them. It's kind of funny, just as a side note. We look at the Israelites and all the things that they did or didn't do when God commanded them to do or not do. And now here's something that God never commanded them to do and they want to do, right? Kind of dog chase his tail here a little bit. God said, man, your priorities are a little out of order here. But David did want to build a house for God. And God says, I can't let you build me this house. I can't let you in this land I've given you, in this home I've given you. I can't let you build me a house. And for various reasons, he says, I'm not going to let you build a house, but you know what? I'm going to make you a promise. I'll promise that I'll allow your son to build this house for me. He kind of wraps this all up in this thought about home and descendants and lands and building. He says, also, I will choose a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them. I will plant them so that they can live in their own homes. They will not be bothered anymore Wicked people will no longer bother them as they have in the past. I also tell you that I will make your descendants, here we go, the master builder looking into the future again, I will make your descendants kings of Israel after you. When you die and join your ancestors, I will make one of your sons the next king, and I will set up his kingdom. He will build a house for me, and I will let his kingdom rule forever. Note just for a minute here, each of the men that God's talked to here this morning, Abraham, Moses, Joshua, and David, he tells them, I'm going to do something for you, but it's not just for you. It's not just for you, but it's for the next generation. It's for your descendants. I'm always looking to the future. But not only that, it's interesting that God always has this underlying theme of looking even past the descendants and past the next generation. God is always looking toward the realm eternal. In all of these promises and all these discussions that he has with these men, I'm going to build for you now, I'm going to build for your descendants, and I'm building eternally for you as well. When God spoke to Abraham, he said, I'm going to make you a great nation, I'm going to make you famous, I'm going to give you a family, I'm going to give your descendants land to live on. But what he also said was, and all the people on earth will be blessed through you. The master builder is building for the eternal realm here. This statement is not confined to an immediate family or to an immediate nation. This statement is for all nations, for all time. It is eternal. It is universal. He's speaking of the fact that Jesus would come from his bloodline. He is building for the eternal purposes as well. When God speaks to David and he promises, he says, David, I'm not going to let you build my house, but I'm going to let your son build my house. When he said you're going to have a kingdom that will enjoy peace, when you're going to have descendants of yours sitting on the throne, he also says this to David. But your family and your kingdom will continue always before me. Your throne will last forever. Again, the master builder looking to the realms eternal, alluding to the fact that Jesus Christ now sits on the throne of heaven, our eternal home. He has built that for the here and now, for your descendants, and for the realms eternal. I think as I get ready for this lesson this week, and I really started to consider these concepts of having a place to call home and of building, not only for ourselves but for our descendants. You know, I really think these are some concepts that we need to take note of and really apply in our own lives. I mean, God has provided us home already, right? We have home. We have home in the here and now, don't we? I got a home right here. I got a home with all of you. And it's like any other home. Ups and downs, good and bad. But I have a home. I have some place where I belong. Some place where I can retreat to in times of crisis. Some place where I can share joy with. I have home right now. But we're also being built for the future. We've been built for the here and now. We're also being built for our descendants. And we're also being built for the realms eternal. This next scripture, you know, I'd never given this next scripture much thought, read through it probably a couple hundred times in my life, and kind of glossed right through it until this week, where it has special meaning to me. I love this. This is from Peter writing here. As you come to him, Jesus, the living stone, rejected by humans but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. You also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house. You know, this is the only scripture in the Bible that refers to us as living stones. What we're called here is living, breathing building materials. How do you feel about that? We are being built by the master builder into a spiritual house that has purpose, that has commonality. A house that is being built upon a solid foundation. Jesus Christ is the foundation stone of this house, and all the other building materials that have been dipped in that creosote, that have been dipped in baptism, that have been preserved, whose life has been preserved, now sit on top of that foundation. So we know our foundation is sure. Look around the room at each other. Look around. These are the building materials that God has selected. Yikes. This is the stuff that God says He's going to use to build Himself this eternal spiritual house. And guess what? We don't get to choose the stones that God builds His house with. God selects the stones. I'm just hoping I'm not like cemented down beside you, because God has built a home for us right here and right now, but He's also building with an eye to the future. He's saying, I'm building you as a spiritual house of praise. You are a priesthood. I'm putting you together in the way I want you. Stones. I'm building you as spiritual stones into a building. I'm putting you together with love. That's the concrete that holds us together. His love for us and our love for one another. That is what holds these stones together. Because without the love of God, without love for each other, this whole thing falls apart, doesn't it? And this spiritual house He's building is not just for us. It's for others. It's for our descendants. There are people who have never even known that they were a stone yet. There are people out there that are stones that don't know they're stones. But I wonder if we've really, each one of us, have we really surrendered ourselves and accepted the role of building material? God, use me in any way you want. Build me into what you need me to be. Or have we kind of resisted that? Have we resisted saying, God, the whole potter clay thing, Potter, make this lump of clay whatever you want me to be. Build me in what you want. That's what we strive for here. That's what we're striving to do now. We're striving to reinvent ourselves into being people who will say, God, do with us what you want. Make us what you want us to be. And even though we are building materials, quite frankly, we're also builders. What kind of builder are you? Do you build for the here and now only? You build only things you can see, touch, and feel? Or are you building with an eye to the future? Are you building for your descendants? Are you building for the realms eternal? There's three things I think we can do, each one of us, to ensure that we are good builders, building for the future, building for the descendants, building for eternity. There are things that we can do here now that, this is scary to me, there are things that we can do here and now that have impact in eternity. That ought to give you some pause. Three things we can do. First thing we can do is we can take care of the little stones. We just kicked them all out of here a few minutes ago. We got to take care of the little stones. We got to mold them and shape them into usable building materials. We have to set them on the foundation of Jesus. And listen, just because one of those little stones aren't going home with you after church today, just because you can't claim them on your tax return, doesn't mean you don't have a responsibility to those little stones. Those little stones are part of the same structure that we're part of, right? That spiritual house that God is building. Those little stones are all our responsibilities. Let's take care of the little stones. The next thing we can do is look around the room again. Take care of our fellow stones. Take care of our fellow stones. I didn't say rock heads, I said stones. It is God's intent to build us together, so let's build each other. Let's build each other up. Sometimes I think we try to jackhammer ourselves apart through disagreements, through grudges, through whatever. The master builder says, I'm building you together into a house. Please don't tear it apart. You know, I get this image in my head of this huge spiritual temple that God is building, and inside the temple there's this wall, and it's the wall of Edgewood, right? It's all the Edgewood stones. I wonder what our wall looks like. Does it look like someone took a sledgehammer to it? Are the rocks loose in our wall? That concrete of love, is it not holding us fast together? We need to build one another up because God wants to build with us. The third thing we need to do, I kind of alluded to it before, there are precious stones out there that don't know they're stones yet. There are building materials that God needs, and they're still out there. Maybe they're still buried in the ground and need to be excavated. Maybe they're in a quarry that needs to be cut. They need to be cut away. There are precious building materials out there, and it is God's intent to use them as well. Stones that desperately want to be part of something. Stones that want to be built into something. They desire that concept of home. A place where they can feel like they belong, where they have shared experience and common history, a place where they can retreat to in time of crisis, a place where they can share joy. God has given us a home in the here and now. We need to keep building upon that with stones that have yet to be discovered. What kind of builder are you? I look at this stone wall here that I have on the screen. Some stones are big, some stones are small. Some stones may seem insignificant to you in here, but you know, the fact of the matter is, see this little stone right here? If you take that little stone out, guess what happens to these 4 stones around here? They become loose, and they can fall out. Every stone in this wall has purpose. Every stone in this auditorium this morning has purpose. And without you fulfilling your purpose, guess what? We're not as strong a wall as we could be. Start building today. Build for the here and now. Build for your descendants. And build for the realms eternal. Let's all stand and sing.